Hi, good evening to everyone. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible? Okay, yeah. Good evening. Good evening. Kalpesh was like, who's gonna write so lengthy of a word like good evening? So it's just be GEV. You know, just go around and decode this. Nice, great. Good evening to everyone. Good evening. Are, I'm kidding. Don't never ever take my jokes on a serious note. Hai na? I have a very bad habit of joking around. Anyways, so yeah, Kalpesh is being like, we know that. Great. Good evening to you too, Abhinay. Good evening to you too. Quickly, how many of you here are coming for the very first time? हाँ, अभी layout के बारे में we'll discuss it at the end of the session. But how many of you joining this session for the very first time? Huh? How many of you are joining the session for the very first time? If you are, just give me a me. Okay. Okay. So you guys didn't join, I guess, the front end part. You know? Okay. Got it. Got it. All right. Not an issue. Not an issue. Few rules to everybody. Whenever you are texting in the chat section, just know the basics. Basics is okay. We'll not do anything with front end for today. We're just gonna have a look on the programming aspect of JavaScript today, and we'll do a lot of stuff because see, technically, if you'll talk to me, if somebody would be asking you that I'm going to go around and complete everything in JS in just for 3 days, trust me, that's not gonna happen. Hi Twinkle, hi. So that's not gonna happen, and so is not gonna happen in our case. I'm not gonna give you like everything of an insight about JavaScript, but yeah, I'll give you a good knowledge about JavaScript. That is something. Yeah, the main topics on JavaScript that would be completed. The difficult and the typical part is not gonna be done. No. So that will start tomorrow. The reason is because even if you want to do something for front end like DOM and stuff like that, you'll require few things of JavaScript. So we'll cover out the basic part. Yeah, like functions, arrays, array literals, object literals and stuff like that. So we'll do that. String, yeah, a lot of basic. Okay, for first of all, how many of you here are like never been into programming, like you have never seen anything in programming, like you have not done any programming, maybe C++, Java, like you have never been into programming. Anybody from here like who has never been to programming? That's fine. That's completely fine. Like if you are, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I was telling you about the rules. Whenever you're texting in the chat section, make sure that you text it to everybody, because what happens is sometimes you're asking questions and the same question is in somebody else's mind. So what happens is that he feels a little comfortable that okay, fine, somebody has asked this question. So whenever you're texting, even if you're writing yes, just do it like publicly, so that will start to make more sense. All right, so I have shared you out with the screen. I believe you could see the screens, I guess. Can you see the screens? A quick yes or no, and then we'll move ahead. Hannah? Chalo. Good, great. All right. So first of all, let's set the agenda for the session. Let's talk about this course completely on JavaScript. Let's talk about that, and then we'll move ahead and do a lot of stuff. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Yeah, recordings of the session, you'll get it. I believe you might have got like the remaining 2 or 3 video recordings. Did you get that? I believe you got the previous recordings. Yeah, one more thing. We were thinking of to create a Discord channel. How about that? Like we can have a proper channel wherein even if you wanna like put your doubts around with, you can do that. How about that? Huh? So okay, yeah. So what we'll do, we'll ask the team to like connect you people onto the yeah. So we'll ask our team to connect you people to the Discord channel. Most probably today, go around and create your accounts on Discord. If you have not heard of Discord, I'll highly will suggest you go around and read about it on not Slack, not Slack. My Slack is like completely professional. Hai. So if you are already on Discord, Discord, go around and create your profiles. If you have already, great. If you haven't, go around and do that. Most probably by tomorrow, or maybe most probably by tomorrow, you will be joined to the Discord channel. Therein we'll post out the links for the recordings, or if you'll be having any doubts, or if there is like any message which is needed to be conveyed, we can go around and do that. Hai. So that is something that we'll do. All right then. So let's move on to the real stuff, and let's discuss few things. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. I believe my voice is audible to everybody. I'm just hoping so. Discord is kind of like a social networking site, but it's like kind of like more secure way of dealing with people. It's not like WhatsApp or something, so everything is private. It's like Signal, if you might have heard about. If you follow Elon Musk, you definitely would have heard about Signal. It's kind of like Signal plus WhatsApp, kind of like a situation, right? So it's like it's getting its own popularity now these days. But yeah, it's fairly new. It's new in the market, and we'll be creating channels for the same, and we'll do that. Yeah, I've seen that, so it's great too. All right then, so let's start. Let's not waste much of our time. So today's whole session is going to be based on JavaScript, or rather I should not write it like this, because a lot of people will have a lot of stuff to say. So let's call this JavaScript. Sometimes people even call this JS, so that is something that you can also do. I even also call it JS. So let's start with we'll start with two things. That first of all, what JavaScript is all about, and why is JavaScript so popular these days. JavaScript is a programming language, and this programming language is fairly very simple for the people who are like beginner to programming. Like it's somewhat related to if you just have a look on it, syntactically it's somewhat similar to it's somewhat similar to Python, but not exactly similar to Python, but it has its own more advantages over Python. Python sometimes have more advantages on JavaScript. Like if you talk about machine learning, data science, all of these things, Python can do well, but JavaScript cannot. But if you talk about higher order, calculations and stuff like that, the more performance part, JavaScript is way better than Python, right? Python has a very slow binding as compared to JavaScript. So JavaScript is required at the time when you need faster, performance as compared to any other programming language for that matter, right? So let's start to talk with what JavaScript is all about and what JavaScript typically is. So it's a programming language, as we have just said. It's a programming language, but this programming language is, it's an interpreted programming language. Just like for the people who have worked on Python, they would know that what an interpreted programming language is. That what happens in JavaScript is that whatever you're writing on JavaScript, any of the files that you're creating and you're keeping the extension at .js. So what happens, the interpreter starts to look onto your code and it executes the code. No, it's not a scripting language. No. JavaScript is a programming language, right? It's a high level programming language, just like Python, right? It's a programming language and it's an interpreted programming language. That means that everything that you're writing inside the file, which you're calling this a .js file, so interpreter will look into your file and will execute your program line by line. Interpreted means doing something line by line, right? Java, I was coming to this because a lot of people have a false notion that Java and JavaScript somehow are related or they are cousins or something like that. They're definitely not. Java is like completely object-oriented based compiled language. Rather, it's a multi-dimensional interpreted language. We'll come to that. Second thing is that it follows ECMAScript, or sometimes even people call that it is ECMAScript itself. So it follows ECMAScript. For the people who have not heard about ECMA, it's called as ECMAScript. So JavaScript follow ECMAScript. There are a lot of other scripting languages as well, I should give a JScript or TypeScript or all of these things. These all kind of like scripting languages fall into the same hood, which is called as ECMA language, right? If you're trying to learn Angular, you'll come across with TypeScript for sure. TypeScript is basically a superset of JavaScript with few added functionalities. I'll come to ECMAScript for a little second. ECMAScript is basically few set of rules that all of these programming languages which follow under ECMAScript has to follow. React is not a programming language. React is a framework. It's a front-end framework. I guess you people have a lot of false notions about JavaScript and all of these technologies. I guess so, because I'm seeing questions which has no head and no foot. Like, as in like these questions are like completely blank. So React is, first of all, not a programming language. It's a front-end framework. We'll talk about that when we'll go around with React. React is only used for creating front end, like HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, including a little bit of JavaScript here and there. It's not a programming language. You can create websites, you can create web pages, you can create websites using React. React is not a programming language. React is a framework. It's a front end framework, right? And what we are talking about is a programming language, out of where you can go around and you write your own programs and stuff like that. We'll talk about this. Don't worry. We'll talk about everything and you'll get a clear idea what JavaScript is. And the most important part about Python and JavaScript is they are multi-dimensional or multi-paradigm. Multi-paradigm. Anyone who has worked on Java here? Anyone who has worked on Java or maybe C or C++? Angular is related to JavaScript. Angular, JavaScript, React, they are all related to JavaScript. So if somebody might have worked on Java, they could understand the pain which I'm about to call, is that if you're writing something in not exactly C++, because even in C++ you can just create main and just start writing your code. But specifically Java people, they have a very bad habit of creating classes and then inside classes creating public static void main. And inside that, you're going to write your own code. And even the public static void main is inside a class for the people who have worked on Java, right? So my perspective of calling Java out here is going to be that you cannot think about anything writing even just a simple statement outside a class. That means it's completely based on class. It's a class paradigm. But when you talk about JavaScript is multi-paradigm. You can create everything as functions. You can create everything as classes. You can create everything, whatever you want, right? It's not restricted to only class object kind of like a paradigm, or maybe just functions or functions related paradigm or stuff like that. Let's not talk about classes and objects as of now. Most probably in this session we'll cover out what is classes, what is object. These videos will be provided, don't worry about that, right? So if you want to learn something like React, you will have to go around and have to learn JavaScript, that is for sure, right? Because React.js makes complete use of JavaScript, even in the front end, even at the back end. Everywhere that you'll be writing React, you'll be have to follow around with JavaScript, right? So JavaScript is going to be very important for you people. We'll be covering out React, and most probably next week we'll start with the React course. So in that case, I'll be giving you a wholesome idea about what React is and how to create applications on React and stuff like that. Okay, and the most important part, that when you talk about JavaScript is the language of the browser, right? It's a language of the browser. And why we call this the language of the browser? Because the only language that your browser knows is just JavaScript. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These are the only three foundational languages that your browser know, and this is the language of the browser, right? So browser only knows how to render JavaScript. It has no idea what TypeScript is. It has no idea what ECMAScript is. It has no idea about anything. The only idea that it knows is to how to render JavaScript. So that is why JavaScript is called as the language of the browser. Now, a lot of people would have a lot of questions related to this ECMAScript. So let's go to ECMAScript and let's try to figure this out, that what ECMAScript is all about. So if I go to Google and just write ECMAScript, ECMAScript. So I'll just give you a little handsome idea about what ECMAScript is. So ECMAScript is basically a standard. How many of you here are from CS background? How many of you are here from CS background? Okay, so yeah, in this case, you might have learned a subject called as computer networks, and in those computer networks, you might have heard about a term called as IEEE. Have you heard about IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, right? So if you talk about IEEE, you have not heard about IEEE. I'm really shocked. For the CS people who have not heard about IEEE, I'm really worried about you people. So it's kind of like a language specification. So if you could see out here, the ECMAScript is recently launched in 2020 as well, right? So there are a lot of changes which have been made in JavaScript, but it's a language specification. And this language specification just basically gives you what your language can do, right? It's a guide, it's a standard that how your programming language is going to work. And the most recent, it's going to be, yeah, even BCA people also, you might have heard about all of these things who are learning about computers. They definitely would have come across with a word called as IEEE, right? So in this case, when you talk about ECMAScript is nothing but a language specification, right? It's a language specification which tells that what your JS can do and what your JS cannot do, right? So it's a language specification. It sets the standard, and the most important part here is that in this course we'll be learning ES6, which is called as ECMAScript 6, which is like very recent, right? And a lot of people make use of ES6. There are earlier versions as well, like ES5, and there are few features that I'll be telling you in between as well that this was not supported in ES5, and like this is fairly new. For example, if you talk about higher order array methods that we're going to have a look on, that's completely based on ES6. Even we'll start with, yeah, ES7 is out now, but nobody is using it, still in the beta version as of now. A lot of people are not working on ES7 right now. So what we are going to do, we are going to follow the industry norms. We are going to learn ES6, and further, maybe, you know, some after times. I'm still working on ES7 though, to be very honest. I'm still new to ES7 because there are a lot of beta versions that are going out, right? So with every beta version, there is a new change, right? So in that case, we'll be sticking up to ES6. We'll be learning everything that we'll be doing is going to be on the basis of ES6, right? Now the point here arises that why are we learning JavaScript? Because of the point where I ended. First of all, we are learning FSD, which is full stack development. And in full stack development, we are most interested in the browser part. So that is one of the reasons we are learning JavaScript. First of all, it's the language of the browser. If we don't know how to write anything in language of the browser, then that's a point of worry. Second thing, that it's very interactive. You can do a lot of interactions with the UI part, right? As Kalpesh said, that it's a backbone for front end, and not only for front end, even for back end. Even if you talk about Node and Express, these are few things wherein you just write JavaScript even in the back end, right? For example, if you work on Node, or if you are trying to create your own APIs, in that case, you can go around and create your own APIs on something called as Node. And even on Node, you can create your whole backend based on JavaScript. So JavaScript is a very versatile language wherein you can use this in either in front end or back end or pretty much wherever that you want, right? So even client side, as few people are saying, even on the client side, even on the server side, you can write JavaScript pretty much everywhere, right? And there are a lot of extensions for the same. For example, if you talk about Node is completely based on JavaScript. And even when you talk about Mean and Mern as a stack, you might have heard about Mean, you might have heard about Mern. These are all stack. These are full stacks. So in this case, when you talk about E and when you talk about N, in this case, it's called as Express and Node. And these Express and Node are also based on JavaScript. So like this becomes Express.js, like is an older version. What we work on is Express. Don't call this Express.js. Even Angular.js and Angular 2 plus is like two complete different parallel universe, right? So don't ever call this Express.js, just Express. There is nothing like Express.js anymore. So when we talk about the front end part, you can create a lot of interactive front end part. For example, if you remember, if you might have attended my session, I told you that when you create a form, every form goes somewhere, right? Every form is submitted somewhere. So where this is going to be submitted, you can write a JavaScript for the same. For example, even if you're creating forms, you can go around and validate your forms. For example, if you remember when I told you about that, that there is, even when you talk about a button, for example, there is a property in the button which you call this as disabled. So you can go around and validate up your whole form, and you just be like, if your user is not filling all the forms or all the form fields, then you're not going to activate that button until and unless your user is not going to fill all that form. We'll do that. We'll do in tomorrow's session when we'll have a look on DOM. So because DOM is very, very important. But before we actually go around DOM, we'll have to do that. We'll have to learn the basics of JavaScript first. So that's what we are going to do in this session. We'll just be talking about how to write code on JavaScript. But once we are done with that, from tomorrow onwards, we'll start with DOM, which is basically short for Document Object Model. And I'll be telling you a lot of things that you might never have heard about. HTML is a tree-based structure, and you can go around and extract pretty much from like HTML and stuff like that. So we'll start with DOM in tomorrow's session. But today we'll just be learning the basics of JavaScript. And trust me, if you don't know what I'll be telling you today, trust me, you'll not understand anything in tomorrow's session. You can communicate to me either on Instagram or maybe LinkedIn or maybe anywhere for that matter. At the end of the session, I'll follow you up with my contacts, so you can go around and contact me and communicate with me if you want. All right, then. So let's move ahead and let's start to create small little applications. And let's start to code around with JavaScript. For that, I'm going to go to VS Code. Oh, this is not yours. But let me open up your, I believe it's in desktop and TFA, and let me just go around and open this up. Okay, and in here, what I'm going to do, we have created three things, right? HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. So let me go on. Don't be pretty much reliable to any of the one, I'll say. But yeah, VS Code is pretty awesome. So let me just call this JavaScript. And we'll be doing pretty much everything here in this folder. And I'm just going to go around and upload that up. Yeah, this is the very first class of JavaScript, by the way. Yeah, definitely. Very first class. So let's do JavaScript today. So in JavaScript, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to create an index.html file, right? And in this index.html file, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to create a boilerplate code. We have discussed everything out here that we have done in front-end classes. So if you just want to go around and have a look, you can go it and look at on YouTube. I'll share the links. Yeah, we have done that. We have done that already. And I'll show you out with the links. You can go around and have a look on those, right? So I've discussed everything: HTML, CSS, Bootstrap. Now we are coming to JavaScript. Who's following along, right? And trust me, today's session is going to be very, very important for the people who wants to learn JavaScript from front end and back end perspective. Yeah, responsiveness, everything that we have done in Bootstrap already. Yeah. All right. So if you're ready, we can start, shall we? If you're ready, we can start. You ready? Sure. Now, let's start with JavaScript first of all. So when you talk about JavaScript, what happens is, what do you do if you want to write JavaScript? Let's say you just want to write JavaScript. So first of all, what I'm going to do, I will have to go around and load this first. Let me go around and go to the live server first. And I'm just going to copy this out. And I'm just going to close this tab. And I'm going to open this tab on Google Chrome. I don't use Chrome much because Chrome is not secure. So my default browser is definitely not Chrome. How many of you are scared of Google, by the way? If you're not, you should be, by the way. If you're very reliant on Google, don't be. Firefox is, it's okay. I'm just gonna say localhost 5500/JavaScript/. Yeah, so this will do the job. In here, I'm just gonna change the title. I'm just gonna say JS course. Save, everything would get rendered. Now, let's start with JavaScript. Everybody's here. Everybody's here. Now, just start to pay attention, okay? Now, the very first thing that you should be knowing that I have not told you as of now, there is a developers tool in Google Chrome, right? And this is pretty much available on any of the web browser that you would be working with. It's available in Safari, it's available in Chrome, definitely. It's available in Firefox or any, don't use Opera and stuff like that. So if you work on any good web browser, there would be a developers, developers tool, DevTools. So if you'll just click out here on the three dots, and if you just come out here to more tools, you'll see something called as developers tools out here, right? So just go around and click on to this developers tool and you'll see a small little window being popping up from bottom top. And out here, you will see something like elements, right? Because I don't have elements, so like it doesn't show me any elements. So I'm just gonna cross this out. So this is few of my elements. And then out here, you'll see something called as console. And this is important for us, for any JavaScript developer who is working on it and wants to see his results, all the results that he'll be seeing, he's going to see his results out around here. I'm just gonna go around and minimize this, right? So that you can go around and have a look. Okay. And now what we are going to do, I'm just gonna put something like out here. I'm just gonna say H1 JS course, save, and this would be out here. And then I'm going to write something. Okay, I'm going to write something. Now, first of all, you should understand this, that if you're working on JavaScript, there are multiple ways of rendering JavaScript. Okay, the very first thing, this the name of the organization is Technology for All, right? We'll follow you out with the details at the end of the session. Don't worry about that. Okay. Now, when you talk about JavaScript is a language which could be rendered out onto front end pretty much on multiple ways, right? You can go around and mention that up. This is the first session of JavaScript, by the way. JavaScript. Okay. Render as in like when you want to show something on your front end, right? When you want to execute that. Rendering means when you want to execute that, right? So if you want to execute your JavaScript, there are multiple ways. And I'm only going to tell you two ways because I don't want to confuse it, because a lot of people here are looking into JavaScript for the very first time, right? And we have done that already. I'll forward you out with the recordings. Okay. And what happens in JavaScript is, that you can render or you can execute your JavaScript in two ways. There are multiple ways. I'm not saying that it's only going to be two ways. There are multiple other ways as well, using Node, using a lot of other things. But the two very important things that you need to understand, that you can render or execute your JavaScript using two ways in front end. First, by mentioning up a tag in HTML, which is called a script tag. And inside this tag, whatever you will be writing, whatever you will be writing in JavaScript, any of the code that you will be writing in JavaScript, between the opening and closing tag of the script, what you'll see that it will start to execute, right? For example, I'll just give you one example. I'll come to this, right? If let's suppose if I write console.error, or let's start console.log, and I'm just going to say hello world. Hello world. If I save this, you'll see hello world being printed out here on my console. As you can see in the developers tool, I have something called as console. And in here, you'll see everything being rendered out here. This is one way of rendering or executing up your JavaScript. JavaScript is not case sensitive. Case sensitive as in like, yeah, okay, if you're talking about console, yeah, the console has to be written in exactly this way. So it's not like HTML that you can write everything in caps or everything in lower, or you do not need to worry about case sensitive. It's very, very case sensitive, right? So however I'm writing, you are also supposed to write the exact same way. So yes, it's case sensitive, right? So one way we have talked about this, one way, either you can mention any of the things that you want to execute inside the script tag. This is one way. This is the inline way of writing the same thing. The another way of writing the same thing, we'll talk about that. The another way, which is more practical way of writing scripts in JavaScript, is by creating a file and rendering that out the way we used to do in CSS and Bootstrap and stuff like that. So what we can do, we can just come here, and in this, I'm just gonna create a new file, and I'm just gonna call this main.js. JS is the extension for JavaScript. For example, if you're working on HTML, you write .html. If you're working on CSS, you write .css. If you're working on JavaScript, you write .js, right? So you can create an external file, and in the script tag, you can just mention out the source, right? And you can just say that I want to go to JavaScript, and from JavaScript, I just want to go to main.js. If you'll save this, and if you write here console.log, or rather, I'm just going to write log. I'm just going to say hello world. Save, and you'll see hello world written on your console, right? Now, as I told you, yeah, you can also do it. Which one is better? Of course, the way I'm working is definitely better, because we have a habit, as I told you, even I told this to you about it when we were starting up with JavaScript, with CSS. I told you that it's not a good way of writing and embedding everything in one file. You try to keep everything separated, right? So it's a good practice of creating CSS differently, HTML differently, JavaScript differently, and merging them back up together using tags in the HTML. If you're working on CSS, you'll write a link out here. If you're working on JavaScript, you'll write script out here, right? So it's a better approach of writing different technologies into different files. That's definitely a better option, right? So this is how it'd be working. All right. Okay. So I hope till here everybody is okay. If you're okay till here, just give me a yes. We'll move ahead. We good till here? Chalo. Let's move to main.js then, right? Now, when you talk about JavaScript, there are multiple ways of outputting the same stuff, right? The first thing that I just showed you, there is something called as console, and in that console, you can log something out. It's exactly like for the people who are working on Java, it's exactly like writing system.out.println, and whatever you want to write out here, right? It's exactly the same thing. It's fine. It's fine. I generally will speak in English, right? So you can go around and do something like system.out.println, and if you're working on Java, if let's suppose if you're working on C, you'll just write in C, what do you call this as? I guess it's called as printf, if I'm not wrong. If you're working on C, you write printf. If you're working on C++, you write something called as cout, right? If you're working on Python, you just write print, right? And so on and so forth. But if you're working on JavaScript, there are multiple ways of outputting the same stuff over and over again. One way of writing the same thing is either doing something called as console log. Then there is also something called as console.error, right? Or before I actually go with error, let's say alert. Let's talk about alert first. So if you just write alert, and I'm just going to say hello world, right? And if I save this, you'll see it will just give you an alert, and it says localhost 5500 says hello world. So this is one way of doing the same thing. But the problem with alert is that it halts everything, right? So you cannot see anything for the background, right? Whatever you have written in the document will halt, and only the JavaScript will run. So that's not a good for us. There are multiple other ways of doing the same thing, right? So you can just come here and say console dot error, and you can just say hello, error occurred, right? So if you'll save this, you'll see this in red color, right? So this is one way of doing the same thing. Okay, so you can just write hello, error occurred or something like that. You can also just come here and say what you can say. Either you can do a console log. You can just also say console.warn. So it will be yellow in color, hello error occurred, or what you call this, a warning occurred, right? Anything that you want. So this is a different way. We'll not go into document.write because we have not learned about DOM. So document is related to DOM. When we'll start with DOM, we'll talk about document.write or document.inner HTML and stuff like that when we'll start with DOM. No, definitely not. You can attach two different JavaScript files, but that completely depends that which file is needed to be occurred at what time. You'll have to completely will mention that out. So in this case, what I'll be using the most is going to be console log for printing out anything. So this would look something like this. So this is called as console log, and you'll see the output in your developers tool. We good till here? So we've talked about three things. Either you can do console log, console error, or console warn. All the three will do the same thing, is to output whatever you have, right? And this is how this will work. Now let's come to the more important part, is variables. Let's start with variables. And alongside, I'll also be creating cheat sheets for you. So let's start with variables. Are you ready? Are you ready? Variables. Let's start to talk about variables first. For the people who have no idea about programming languages and they have no idea about what variables are, let's start to talk about variables. Variables, in case of any programming language, is just basically a container. It's a container where you are putting some values and being like, you know what, just save it for me. And whenever I'd be needing these values, I'll call you by your name. It's kind of like an identifier, right? You store a few values inside containers, inside few identifiers. And once you make those identifiers, you can call those identifiers, change the values, or use those values. For example, let's suppose if I have a value 10 and I want to store it inside a variable or a container, and you can name that container pretty much anything, maybe a B, C, or I can just call this variable or var, right? So I cannot call this bar, but let's call this variable. So variable is equals to 10. So now this would be a container now, and every time I wanted to call 10, I'll just call variable, right? In case of JavaScript, in order you want to create a variable, there are three types how you can create variables. Either you can use something called as let. There is something called as, before I actually go around and talk about let, let's talk about var, let, and const. There are three ways how you can create variables in JavaScript. Listen to this very carefully because a lot of people are generally confused about all of these three. There are three things. Either you can use something called as var, let, or const. These are three ways how you can create variables in JavaScript. Var has been in JavaScript pretty much from the start of JavaScript, when firstly the JavaScript was launched. So var is like very old school. When you talk about let and const, these are ES6 emissions, right? So these were introduced in ES6, let and const. And there are a lot of difference between var, let, and const. And let's go around and explore them for a little second, right? Whenever, now listen to me very carefully. You'll get it. You'll get it on mail. Okay? You'll get it on mail. For the previous courses, you'll get the certifications on your mail. Don't worry about that. Rather, why are you so worried about the certification and all of these things? You should be worried about the learning part. Right? So if you're learning something, that's your the most biggest certification. Right? Chalo. Let's start with var, let, and const, and let's try and figure out what would be the differences between the same. Okay? So in this case, what would happen that if you talk about var is a very global scenario, or it has what you call this as a scope of global. That means that if you create var, and let's say you create something, let's say fruits, or just a fruit, and if I keep this as, let's say, banana, so in this case, this fruit will be accessible pretty much from anywhere of the main.js. Like if you're talking about, and if you're keeping something as fruit as var, this fruit will be accessible from anywhere in the JavaScript, anywhere from the JavaScript. No matter if you're working inside a function, inside an array, inside a if condition or a else condition or stuff like that, hardly matters. This will have a global approach, a global approach. But what happened in ES6, they said that I should have something of a thing where I can just keep something in a local scope, not creating everything globally, because everything would be accessible and that won't be a secure thing, right? So in this case, what happens is you can create something called as let and something called as const. In the case now let's try and understand the differences between let and const. The very basic difference between var, let, and const is var has a global scope, whereas let and const has a local scope. Local scope as in like in a block level scope, in a block level scope. But in this case, when you talk about let and const, let and const has a lot of differences between the same. Let's talk about that, right? Let's say if I want to create a variable, I'll just say let a is equals to 10. And then if I just come here and I just say console.log a, you'll see 10 would be printed out here because that's the value of a, because I said that whatever value that you will be containing, you will call that value through the identifier you are keeping this identifier as. Okay. Now in this case, what I can do, I can actually change the value, right? If I can change the value, I can just come here and be like, hey, now from today onwards, a is going to be 20. Now if I'll save this, console log will say, hey, okay, fine, you know, you said that a is going to be 20, so I'll assume that a is going to be 20 forever, right? So that means changes in the case when you're working on let could happen, and the changes could also happen if you're working on var, because but var will be having a global scope that will crash all the security part. But if you want to be more secure, you'll just generally will use let, or you'll generally will use const. I never you work on var anymore. I just either use let or I just either use const. And a lot of developers generally do that, right? So in case of let, you can actually go around and change the values. But the same thing, if I try to do with const, and if I try to save this, you'll see that the JavaScript will start to throw me an error. It will say that you have tried to change or update the value of a constant variable. So this const basically shorts for constant, right? That means you are creating a constant which is a is equals to 10, and you cannot go around and change the values, right? You cannot change the values in the case if you're working on const. So keep that in mind. If you're working on let and const, let can actually let you change the values, but if you're working on const, it's always going to be constant. You cannot go around and change the values. Even in JavaScript, this is also not acceptable, that you just create const a and just be happy with this, and it will say that it's missing the initializer. But if I'll do the same thing in case of let, if I just say let a and then I assign a is equals to 20 and just say console.log a, you can say that I can do that with let as well, right? So I can just, you know, just declare a and then assign the value of a laterwards. That is something I can do with let. But the same thing, if I try to do it with const, this will start to throw me an error being like, you cannot do that. You will have to initialize the values. So until and unless I don't do something like this, this will not be acceptable in JavaScript. And you could see that it will start giving an error at line number 8, saying that you're trying to reassign the value of a. But if I don't do that and save, you'll see that constant is going to work perfectly fine. So if you're very insecure about that, how the security of your application is going to go, I'll highly will recommend you go around and use const. And most of the time, I also use const a lot. But certain times when I know that I'll have to change the values, I use the value as let, which is more secure because it has a scope of block level. What's a block? We'll talk about that in a little second. So I hope these three variables, how you're going to create variables using var, let, and const is okay for everyone. Let's quickly take a recap. For the case when you're working on var will have a very global scope. Everything and anything that you're writing inside main.js could go around and access whatever you're writing as a var, right? But this is not secure. So we generally write let and const, which are, which were introduced at the time when you're working on ES6, right? So let just makes you, declare the variable and assign them later, right? And reassignment is also applicable when you're working on let. But in case of const, you'll have to declare the variable and assign the variable at the same time, and you cannot go around and change the values over and over again when you're working on something called as const. So that is something that you'll have to keep in mind, right? Chalo. Now let's start with, can you explain the same using arrays? I'll do that. When I'll be doing something called as loops, then I'll be explaining you. Okay. Mostly I'll be using const. Most of the time I'll be using const. You'll see me writing a lot of const when I'll be doing DOM. I don't like working on let either, but because I find const being more secure, so I use const more as compared to let. So it's personal preference. You can choose pretty much anything that you want, right? Chalo. I'll give you the cheat sheet at the end, hai na? So I'll upload the cheat sheet on your GitHub link. So don't worry about that. All right, so let's move ahead. Let's start with data types, the primitive data types. So I'll start with primitive data types. And in JavaScript, there are 6 primitive data types, or I should say, yeah, 6 primitive data types. And let's go around and talk. No integer, no nothing, right? There are 6 primitive data types. Let's talk about that. Okay. So, yeah, let's say I'll just say const name, and I give the value as, let's say, technology for all. Let's say this is the name, right? Let's say const age. Let's say age is, let's say 20 or maybe let's say 30. Yeah. Then we have, let's say, const rating. And let's suppose if I want to keep a floating point number, let's say. So if I just keep 30 or maybe let's say 4.5, let's say, you know, and then I can just say const is school. I can just say true. Then we have const const x, let's say, is equals to null. Let's say const y is equals to undefined. So I guess it's all 6. Chalo. Now in here, let's go around and check the types of each of these values. Check the types. Okay. Now let's try to figure out that what different data types or what primitive data types are supported in JavaScript. Let's go around and explore that. So if I actually go around and do console log and I just write type of, and if I want to mention the type of name and save this, you'll see it's of the type string. So the very first thing or the very first primitive data type that we have is called as string, right? So whatever you'll be writing in double quotes, you're right. So it's exactly like Python. If you want to write something in single quotes, you can write it in single quotes. If you want to write something in double quotes, you can write in double quotes. It's going to assume everything as string, right? But a lot of developers write it in single quotes. So it's a personal preference. Whatever you want to write, you can write it out there. So first primitive data type that we have is string. The second, let's go around and check the type, which is called as age. Let's save that. So it's a number, right? We don't call it integer. Type of is just going to tell you that what the primitive type of, right? What is the data type of a particular variable that you have created. Like we have a variable as an age. So type of is just going to give you the type of that particular, that what is the primitive data type revolving around the same. So type of is just going to give you the primitive data type revolving around that particular variable. So if you're talking about this age variable, so age variable is of the type number, right? So this is called as number. Okay. Yeah, it's exactly like Python, right? And in the case, if you're interested about knowing about the rating, if you'll check the type of rating and try to save this, it will also be of the type number. So there is not something of what you call this in Java. I don't remember what you call this in Java. I guess floating, right? You call this as float, I believe. So float is a primitive data type in Java, if I'm not wrong, right? So in case of JavaScript, it's not the case. You just write number. It's just number as a data type. It's a primitive data type. Same is the case with isCool. So if you'll try to figure out with isCool is a Boolean, right? So this is a Boolean, which is again a primitive data type. Now, this is where something goes wrong, right? So if you'll try to check the type of X and save this, you basically get an object. You were expecting null, but it gives you an object. Let me show you something. So if I go to Google and I write type of null as object JS, if I try to like bring this along and could show you something. So if you'll go to Stack Overflow, this will give you a proper answer for the same. So if you'll just have a look out here, if null is a primitive data type, why the type of null is an object. The reason is that what happened here was a type from the developers of the JavaScript end. So if I could like show you, see, unfortunately in JavaScript, the data type of the null is as an object. You can consider as a bug in JavaScript, right? Wherein the type of this null is kept as an object. So sometimes people try to target you up on interviews as well, that why is the type of as a null? So you'll come out with weird answers for the same key. This happens internally, this happens, and internally this happens. But internally what happens is, see, when you talk about null, if you might have learned C and C++, so there is something called as a null pointer. Have you heard about null pointer? A pointer. You might have heard about the term called as pointer. So the people who are learning JavaScript, who are learning CS. So you might have heard about the term pointer. It's an address. And typically, if you try to look around with the address, what is an address? An address in turn is an object, right? So in case of in order to store null somewhere, you'll have to create a pointer, and in turn, a pointer is an object, right? It's a pointing type value, so it's going to be an object. So this is the reason they had a bug with the same. So this is a bogus, but the type is going to be object. That is something that you'll have to always keep in mind, that the type of object is always, the type of null is always going to give you object. So this could be an interview question as for you people as well. In case of undefined, it's going to just show you undefined, right? So it's just going to show you undefined. So undefined is just undefined. Sorry. Yeah. So this is generally asked, right? So don't fall into the trick. So it's just a bogus. It's a fault from the JavaScript end. So these are the 5 primitive data types: string, number, boolean, object, and null and undefined. Why am I calling object? Null and undefined. So these are 5 primitive data types that we have, right? So are we good with the primitive data type? We'll use this primitive data. Apart from that, no other data could be stored in JavaScript. So that is something that you'll have to keep in mind. All right. Chalo. So this is the case with primitive data types. Now let's start with strings. And let's do a lot of things on strings, right? And on string, the very first thing that I want to show you is called as concatenation. And you'll use this concatenation pretty a lot of times, right? So if I actually keep, let's say, const first name, let's say Arun, and let's say const last name, let's say Kudiyar, right? And I can just go out here and I can just say console log. And if I want to print both the things, side by side, I can just come here and just say, or maybe, rather than just creating it this way, I'm just going to call this name so that I could just show you the different thing as well. So I'm just going to call this. I'm just going to call this age, and I'm just going to say 25. Right. So in console log, I'm just going to say, hi, I am, and whatever the name is going to be, name. You can just write a plus sign, and then you can start with the string. My name is this, and I am, and whatever my age is going to be, right? So if I save this, you'll see, hi, I am Arun Kudiyar, and I'm 25, right? Now, in this case, this is how you'll be doing the concatenations, right? String are mostly asked in array, not exactly, right? Then there is something called as another thing in case of, this is called as string concatenation, right? This is string concatenation. But doing the concatenation, you also use something which was introduced in ES6, which you call this as template literal. So in template literal, rather than, this is going to be a lot of pain, putting plus sign every time. This is going to be a lot of pain. So you use template literal, and in this case, you use backticks. That is most important. You use something called as backticks. And what do? You just write normal, whatever you have. So I'm just going to say, hi, I am. Now you want to keep the variable at this position. So what you'll do, you'll put a $sign, you'll put curly brackets, and you'll put the name of the variable out here, the name variable, and just start to work with the same. So I am, and this will take the position of the name, whatever the name is going to be out here. And I'm just going to say, and I am, and the same thing, dollar, curly brackets, and I'm just going to say age. So if you'll save this, you'll see I'll get the same result, right? So keep that in mind, backticks and dollar curly brackets in order to give you the value of the variable that you have out there, right? So this is something that we can do. Now let's start with string. I just told you what is the difference between Java and JavaScript. So let's move with string methods. So in case of Java and JavaScript, what happens, Rachita, is the Java is a compiled language, wherein when you talk about JavaScript, it's an interpreted language. right? If you talk about Java, Java only focuses on object-oriented programming paradigm. But if you talk about JavaScript, it has multiple paradigm. It could be object-oriented, it could be function-oriented, it could be method-oriented, it could be pretty much anything that you want. So there is no comparison between Java and JavaScript. These are two different parallel universe, and Java and JavaScript has nothing in common in between, rather than they are just both high-level programming language, right? Chalo. So let's start with string methods. Okay, let's start with string methods. Now let's say what I can do. I'm just going to say const str, just a string, or let's not call this str. Let's call this just s, or let's call this str. And let's say const str, and I'm just gonna call this hello world. Let's say. Okay. Now pay attention out here, huh? This could be a little interesting part. Now, if let's suppose if I want to find out the length of this string, right? If you want to find out the length of the string, so in this case, I'm going to use the length property. I can just come here and say log and console log, and I can just say str, whatever the string is, dot. Oh, I think str is already taken. So I'm just gonna call this s, just s, const s. And if I just say s dot, I can just come here and say length. If I'll save this, it will give me 11, right? So if you'll count this, so 5 and 5 plus 1 space bar, right? So if you'll just do dot length, this dot length is going to give you the length of the whole string, that what is the length of the whole string, right? Similarly, you can change the cases if you want. So you can just come here and say log s dot to uppercase. And this is a method basically. So if you'll save this, everything would be in capital or in uppercase. You can also just come here and just say s dot to lowercase. To lowercase, it's a method. Again, this would give you just hello world, something like this, right? What else could be done? In case out here, okay, let me tell you about substring. So let's talk about substring. Let's suppose if you want to find out the substring means, yeah, the space is counted in here. The space is definitely is counted, right? So that is, you'll have to keep in mind. Now, in this case, now from here, I'm going to tell you two more properties, which are going to be very, very useful when you'll be working on front end. So first thing is going to be substring. So substring does what? Substring is exactly the same substring that you might have learned in Python, right? So what happens is that if I try to do something like s dot substring, that is sub str, and in this it takes where it's going to start using the substring, or where is the starting point, and what's going to be the ending point. In every string that you talk about, in case of hello world, if I talk about this hello world, this h in hello world would be counted as 0, and e would be counted as at index 1, l would be counted as index 2, l would be counted at index 3. That means the numbering that is done of each and every alphabet starts with 0. That means alphabet h is going to be at position 0, e is going to be at position 1, L is going to be at position 2, and so on and so forth, right? So in substring, what you can do, you can just mention the positions, that from which position to which position do you want. So if I just go around and do that 0 comma, let's say 7, right? And if I save this, you'll see that it says h0 1 2 3 4 space is 5, and then w is 6. That means the ending point is not included. Keep that in mind. So if I'm giving 0 comma 7, 0 is included, but the letter which is at index 7 is not going to be included in the string. Very, very important. Keep that in mind. I hope this is okay for everyone. Substring. So substring takes the positions of the letters, which goes from 0 to n minus 1. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It goes from 0 to n minus 1. I'll just give you one very basic overview. So if I actually go around and annotate on screen. So what happens out here, if you're writing hello, if let's suppose if you're writing, let me give you the text in white color. So if let's suppose if you're saying, oh, it's not, and this would be in white color. Let's suppose if I'm writing hello world, right? Hello space and then world. So what happens out here in this hello world, this would be treated as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the space is counted as 5. Then this 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. right? Or rather 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. So if I just do s dot substring sub str, I'll have to mention the starting position. So I said I'm going to start from 0, but I'm going to end at 7. That means this 7 is not going to be included. So it's only going to take from 0 to whatever the number that you have given till n minus 1. That is going to be 6. That is what you're seeing is the output. Pradeep, I hope this makes sense. So it's going to start from 0 and go all the way up to 6, but not include 7, right? So this is the utility of what you call this as substring, right? So keep that in mind. So substring only goes from 0 to n minus 1. All right. Now, if you talk about, there is something called a split. Let's talk about split. So in case of split, what happens is split is exactly as same as substring, but in case it does not split the does not create the sub, it splits it into arrays, right? So if I just give you, if I just say let's say, rather I'm just going to say console log, and if I just say s dot split, and if I'm going to split on the basis of nothing, and if I save this, you'll see I get 11 elements in our array, wherein it starts with 0, H, E, L, L, O space. You can see that space is included, W, O, R, L, D, and so on and so forth. And the whole length is going to be 11, right? So you'll get an array out of it. So if you want the array out of something, that is something that you can do. For example, if let's suppose if I'm keeping this string as, let's say, or rather I'm just going to take a new string. If I just keep a string as, let's say, const example, let's say, and if I keep it something like technology, CS, IT, or array, objects, so on and so forth, I can actually go around and split these words into array. And how you're going to do that? You're just going to put comma. So you could see that how these words are separated. These words are separated with a comma and a space. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to put a comma and put a space. And if you'll save this, oh, rather it should be not s, rather example.split. So save, and you'll see I'll get all these 5 letters, which are going to be technologies, CS, IT, array, objects, stuff like that. Slicing is not there in JavaScript. It's in Python. So there is nothing called as slicing in JavaScript. Not go around and slice something. This is how you're going to slice everything up, right? So split is going to, slice everything for you, right? There is nothing as a slice in JavaScript. It's used in Python, not in JavaScript. So all the slicing work is done by split. I hope all the methods make sense to everyone, all the string methods. So you can go around and concatenate. You can do a template literal. You can use string methods like length, uppercase, lowercase, substring, split. All of these things. These are all applicable in case of if you're working on JavaScript. 9. Splice है, slice नहीं है. There is nothing slice in JavaScript. There is splice, but we'll talk about splice when we'll be doing down, not right now. Okay, abhi splice bata ke there is no utility of telling the same thing, right? Don't worry, I'll tell you everything which is important to you in JavaScript. Why are you so worried about everything? I'll tell you everything. Okay, so don't worry about that. So we're starting with very basic, because there are a lot of people who have no idea about JavaScript. They're working on JavaScript for the very first time, right? You might have worked on JavaScript before. That is one of the reasons you know already about splice and all of these things, but don't worry about it. So shall we move ahead? Shall we move ahead? All right. Alrighty then. So let's move ahead. Now let's start to talk about arrays. Right. Now in arrays, in case of JavaScript, is like very, very different than the arrays that you might have seen like in any of the other programming languages. For the people who are coming from C, C++, and Java background, you'll be very amazed to see arrays in JavaScript, because that's like very unusual kind of like a thing in JavaScript. Most unusual, I'll say. So in case of arrays is basically a way of storing multiple values in one variable. So for the people who are working on JavaScript for the very first time, or any of the programming languages, you might have seen that in variables, we were just keeping one value in one variable, right? But arrays do completely the opposite. It just uses one variable and keep multiple values inside it. For example, I can just come here and say const fruits, let's say, and I can create variable or I can create arrays. And if you're talking about JavaScript, in JavaScript, you can create arrays in two different ways. First, either use something of an array constructor, or just by using a sign, which is this sign. Okay, so generally people use second way, but I'm going to start with first way. You can just come here and say new array, and in this new array you can just go around and put stuff, let's say 10 comma 20 comma 30 comma 40 comma 50, and you can just come here and say log. I'm just going to call this numbers, let's say console dot numbers, save, and you'll find an array would be created having index 0 1 2 3 4 and so on and so forth, right? So what's new in here, we'll talk about that, but we can actually create arrays in this case as well. You can just say, let's say const fruits, and you can just start with fruits, let's say apples, or just gonna say apple, mango, oh, what is happening to my keyboard, pear, or what else can we say, grapes, let's say, right? So one more, let's say oranges, right? And if I actually go around and log this out, I'll just say log fruits, save, the same stuff is going to happen with the same thing, right? The length is 5 and these are the values. Now, what's actually different than JavaScript arrays and arrays which you have learned in any of the programming languages? In other programming languages, what you do, you create an array of the same data type. But in case of if you're working in JavaScript, you do not need to worry about what is the type that is being kept. You can again go around and create, contain 10 inside this. You can create, let's say, null inside this. You can contain undefined inside it, right? Undefined inside it. You can put 10.30 inside it, 10.30 inside it, and save, and you'll see that it will not give you any errors. But if you might have come from the backgrounds from C, C++, Java, you'd realize that even if you're creating an array, you'll have to mention the type of an array. For example, specifically, I'm talking about C, C++, and Java, right? So in that case, also, that was a real pain wherein you were supposed to only create arrays out of only one single data type. And also, I have seen people doing this in Java, that before they actually go around and create an array, they have to give what the length of the array is going to be. Do you remember, for the people who have worked on Java? So when you create an array, you say whatever it's going to be is equals to new int, and then you mention the length of whatever the length of the number that you want to go around and keep inside in the array. Java people, I hope you're listening to me. Java people, do you remember about all of these things? For the people who have worked on Java, guys, yeah. So in case of JavaScript, you do not need to worry about any of those things, right? So this is pretty cool in JavaScript. So if you'll save this, this is something that you can totally could do. Again, you can go around and access them up using their indices. That is something also that you can do. You might have already seen this happening in a lot of other programming languages as well. So if you just do fruits 0, fruits 1, and let's say fruits 2, and if you'll save this, you'll get apple, mango, pears, and so on and so forth, right? So this is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on and so forth, right? You can even go around and add values to this. So I can go around and add values. So if, let's suppose, if I want to add the value at the 5th position, I can do that. So let's say I want to mention something as, let's say papaya, right? So if I'll save this and try to console log now, so this will also include papaya on the same thing, right? So if, let's suppose, if you don't know at what index do you want to put that, so if you don't know the index, you can use the method called as push as well. So you can just do fruits.push, and whatever you want to push, you can go around and push that. Let's suppose I want to push, let's say strawberry, save, and you'll see that strawberry would be a part of your same thing, right? Now, let's say you want to include something at the first index, right? So you want to put something something in index 0, let's say, right? You want to insert something at index 0. You could see at index 0, it's called as it's Apple out there, right? But if you want to put something at index 0 at the beginning, so you can just do fruits.unshift, and you can just mention the whatever the value that you want. Let's say in this case, I'm just gonna say watermelon. Save. You'll see watermelon apart out here as well. Watermelon, right? Pretty cool stuff. Then you can actually go around and delete something, delete the values. And the most popular way is just you can just do fruits.pop. And if you just do fruits.pop and if you save this, you'll not see the last most value being depicted out here, which was basically strawberry. So strawberry will not be a part of the list anymore, right? So that is something that you can do. You can again, you can mention the index. You can mention the index, but keep that in mind. It won't shift. It would override, right? It would override the value. It won't shift the values. It would override the values, right? So keep that in mind. So this is something that we can do. You can just mention whatever the index is, and you can do pretty much anything that you want. Now you have a provision in JavaScript. You have a provision of checking if something is an array, or not. So that is what you can do. So you can just say console log, and you can just say array, capital array dot is array, and you can mention, let's say fruits. If I give fruits, so it will give you true because array fruits is an array. But if I just give any string in this case and save, it will give you false because this is definitely not an array, it's a string. Yeah, you can delete that. You can delete any random index that you want. Yes, you can do that. You can do that. You can delete any random index, right? You can do that. All right then. So I believe arrays make sense to everyone. So you can add values, you can add in between, you can add at the end, you can add at the starting, you can remove something, you can do all of these things. So unshift is used just to put anything at the very beginning. If you want to keep something in the beginning, you'll use this method called as unshift, and this unshift will take that value and will put it at the front of the array. That is all. That is the use of unshift. So we're good till here. I hope the arrays is okay for everyone. Are we good with arrays? Are we good with arrays? We'll come back to higher order array methods, right? Most probably in this session, and if we get time, we'll do that. But if we'll not get time, I'll definitely will tell you few of the array methods like map, filter, reduce, all of these things. I'll talk about few of the higher order array methods. All right then, so let's move ahead. Okay, so this was arrays. I'll give you the whole cheat sheet. Array.isArray is just going to check that if something of a variable is a array or not. So in this case, if I just pass fruits, right? I've passed fruits, and if I don't mention this in quotes, it's just going to give you true. Just going to say that yeah, it's an array. Okay, so that's the case. All right, so let's start with objects then. So shall we start? You can just mention the index at whatever index that you want. अरे रुक जाओ, अभी तो कुछ किया ही नहीं. अभी तो you have not even touched, you have not even scratched the surface of JavaScript right now. JavaScript has a lot of things to go around and do. अभी कहाँ से थक गए? अभी तो कुछ किया ही नहीं JavaScript में. You have not done anything in JavaScript. है ना? You have not done anything in JavaScript. I'm recording this video, right? I'm recording this video. You can go around and download this video and have a look on it on your own pace, right? So that would be completely fine. I hope other people are not being like कि बहुत हो गया आज तो, and we have done a lot of things. ऐसा तो नहीं हुआ किसी को? I hope everybody is okay. Everybody is in their full capabilities. Huh? Okay. All right. So let's start with objects then, right? We can start with objects. Now, if you're working on objects, right? If you're working on objects, or typically in JavaScript, we call this object literals. So let's start with object literals then. Now, in case of objects, objects is a way of representation when you have a lot of things and a lot of properties about one single variable. It's kind of, no, not exactly. It doesn't have any entity or behavior. We are not talking about classes. That's a class that you're talking about. So object has nothing to do with state and behavior. That's completely a different thing. But if we talk about objects, objects is a way of representation of a data wherein you have a lot of metadata related to that data. Then you use objects. What is a metadata? Metadata data means data about the data. If let's suppose if I'm talking about a person, let's say if I just say const person, right? If I'm talking about a person is a way of reference. He itself is a data, right? So if let's suppose if I'm saying person one, let's say person one is a data, let's say Arun, or maybe Harry Potter for that matter, right? So Harry Potter is a person, he's a data itself. Now, if I want to keep his own data, that is the metadata of Harry Potter, I can go around and create an object literal for the same. For example, what is his first name? Right, so how do, okay, yeah, I completely forgot that I need to teach you the syntax as well. Okay, so how do we do that? If we want to create an object literal, so what do? We mention that what is the object literal we want to create. In this case, the name of the object literal is person, and if you want to create an object, what you will be doing, you will be doing person is equals to, and put this two curly brackets, and inside these two curly brackets you will be mentioning all the key value pairs that you want to mention out here about the person. For example, I want to mention his first name. So I'll just first name. And in the first name, let's suppose I keep this Harry. Now, this is only one property that I mentioned. I need to mention other properties as well. So what I'll do, I'll put a comma, right? I'll just put a comma. Here, person is a data. And what we are doing, we are mentioning his own data. What's his first name, what's his last name, what's his hobbies, what's his age, what's his address, and stuff like that. So all of these things is a metadata related to the person. And the person itself could be a data, right? So in this case, I'm just going to mention the last name. Let's say the last name is Potter, right? Potter. Let's say age. What was the age of Harry Potter, by the way? I have no idea. I'm just keeping it like very random. Let's say 23. Okay. Let's say I want to store his hobbies, so I can create. Now see here, I can create arrays inside the object as well. So you could see that I'm going to create an array inside an object. So let's say I want to say his interest was magic. Magic was definitely his interest, or hobbies. Studying, let's say. And the third hobby that I was really obsessed with is getting in trouble. So for the people who have watched Harry Potter, he was definitely has a hobby of getting into trouble. He, Hermione, and Ron, right? So getting in trouble, right? You can go around and put an address, so you can go around and put an address in where address itself could be in another object. So I can just come here and I can mention the street. If let's say the street is let's say 50 Street, 50 Main Street, let's say, let's say city. I guess they used to live in London, if I'm not wrong. London, and let's say country, and I believe they were from UK. So I'm just gonna say United Kingdom, right? And this is all, right? And then I can then actually come here and say console log person. So if you'll save this, you'll see this person, right? That is a DOM selector. That's a DOM selector. We'll talk about that. Yeah. So in this case, if you'll just come here, you'll see that hobbies is an array. If you'll open this hobbies has indexes. Hobbies itself is an index which has hobby 0, hobbies 1, hobbies 2, right? These are hobbies. Can you see this? And there is an address, and this address itself is another object. So what we have done, we have created up an own object. In this object, it was containing a data about a person. So it was a metadata. So first name is a metadata, last name is a metadata, age is a metadata, hobbies is a metadata. But hobbies, maybe we internally have more data like magic, studying, and getting in trouble, right? Address itself is a data, but it also has its own particular data. So data about data, metadata about address. So we have put it inside an object. And if you could see that, you can just go around and have a look on this object literal. I hope I didn't confuse you people. Confused to nahi hue? I hope you didn't get confused. Guys, how many of you are confused? How many of you are confused? Be honest. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'll tell you. See, try and understand this. It's very simple. Okay, na? Wrap your head around this. There's no rocket science. This is no rocket science. See, we have a person. It's called, just understand it using a file directory. So we have a folder called as person. Inside this person, we have created different things. So I can say that there is a file called as, let's say, first name. Then there is a file called as last name. So these are files because you cannot go inside them, right? So you can just assume them as file. Then there is a file which is having age, age file. But then there is another folder inside this. This is a folder. I am just gonna keep this folder as this. So this is a folder which is hobbies folder. And inside these hobbies, there are 3 different things: 0, 1, and 2, which is this 0, 1, and 2. Then similarly, I have another bigger folder, which is going to be this folder. And inside this folder, I'm going to create multiple other things, like what would be the street, what would be the city, what would be the country, and so on and so forth. So I hope now this is making sense, that how we are doing this. So inside this person itself is a data, right? And inside this data, what we are doing, we are keeping the key value pairs. And we are also keeping something like as that of folders, which is either could be an array, it could be an array, or it could be an object itself. So what we are doing, we are keeping an object inside, and we are keeping an array inside an object, or we can also contain an object inside another object. I hope this is making sense now. Person is an object. See, how to identify if something is an object or not? Very simple. If you see curly brackets in front of a variable, just try and understand this. If you find out, or I'm just going to write it out here. If you find out that if you have a variable and this variable starts with is equals to square brackets, always it's going to be an array. Always it's going to be an array. For example, hobbies. If you'll just have a look on hobbies, you can identify hobbies as an array because it starts with the square brackets. Similarly, if a variable is going to start from curly brackets, it's always going to be an object. Always going to be an object. For example, address. If you'll have a look on your address, the address starts from a curly bracket. Thus, the address starts with a curly bracket. So I can say the address here is going to be an object. So I can say address is an object. Yeah, I'll do that. Address is an object, but in this case, hobbies is an array. Right? So this is how we do that. Does this make sense to everyone? Are we good till here? Are we good till here? Are we clear? Everyone? Cool. Pretty cool. Now, let's try to talk about how we are going to access these values. This is the important part. We are going to access the values of the object. This is the important part. So what we'll be doing, we'll be accessing the values of the object. So let's say there are 3 ways. Yeah, there are 3 ways. How we are going to do that? First, I'll tell you the easier part. Let's suppose if I want to find out the full name. So full name, I want to find out. So what will I do? I'll just say console log, and I'll say the full name is, and I'm just going to write it like this, backticks, if you remember, the string literal. So I'm just going to say the full name is, and I'm just going to say, put a $sign and put curly brackets, and I can just come here and say person dot first name. So person is a value, and inside that value contains another file which is first name. Do you remember that the architecture which I just drew, right? So inside person you will find out a first name, then space, again the same thing, that person dot last name. Save, and you'll find the full name is Harry Potter, right? Okay. Now If let's suppose if I want to find out which country or from which country does Harry belong from, this would be a challenge. Now see, try and understand how I'm going to write this. So I'm just going to say console log, and I'm just going to say Harry belongs from, and see how am I going to cater onto this. Now, first of all, if I want to talk about Harry, so I'll first of all will write person, right? No, string literals. We just talked about string literals, right? So either you can just do concatenation and do a plus sign. And if you don't want to do this plus sign, you can put a backtick and just write dollar and then curly brackets. Karthik, sorry, Karthik, do you remember? We just talked about this when we were talking about strings. I believe you didn't pay attention, or maybe you were not available at that time. So first thing, what we are going to do, we'll talk about this person. Now from person, I need to go inside the address part. So what would be the address? This would be the address. Now inside the address also, I need to find out what country he belongs from. So I'll save and we'll see Harry belongs from United Kingdom. I hope this makes sense now. So how we are counting down on this. Does this make sense? Guys, does this make sense? Other people, everyone, how are we streaking down to the data? How many of you are still confused? Quickly, if you're confused, remove your confusion today and today itself, because tomorrow most probably I'll not be able to explain you all of these things. Right? Chalo. Now, if let's suppose I want to find out different hobbies of Harry Potter. So I can just come here and say log, and I can just say Harry has 3 hobbies. And what are these hobbies? Now let's have a look on what the hobbies are going to be. This is going to be a little different. So the hobbies that he has is, first hobby, it's going to be what? Person dot hobbies. And now in this hobbies, if you remember, hobbies is an array. So this will only be accessed using the index value, the position value. So I'll just write 0. So this would be the first hobby that will be printed out here. So I'm just going to copy that. Then I'm just going to put a comma, then paste this, comma, and paste this. And I'm just going to say 1, and I'm just going to put and save, and you'll see Harry has 3 hobbies: magic, studying, and I should have put 2. Save. So Harry has 3 hobbies: magic, studying, and getting in trouble. I hope now this makes sense. That how we are going to go around and access all of these values. Make sense? Yeah. So if I'll actually go around and check, if I just say log, I'll just say array dot is array, and I'll pass the value of person dot hobby and save. It will give you true, because person dot hobbies is an array. This is an array. But if I talk about the address, if I say person dot address is an array or not, so it will give you false because it's an object. Kalpesh, I hope this makes sense. Because address is an object, so it give me false. But if I talk about the hobbies, this would give me true because hobbies is an array. Yeah, correct. We separated it by comma because we were working on string literals. Are we good till here? Are we good till here? Are we good till here? Chalo. So these are called as object literals. But apart from object literals as well, there is something called as a bigger picture or a granddaddy of everything that we have learned, which is called as array of objects. Now, this might be a little confusion for you people. So try and understand this, or try to wrap your head around with the same in JavaScript. Huh? No, so I'm see, if you'll have a look out here, I was just making it look pretty. That's it. I'm saying Harry has 3 hobbies. This was magic. And then this comma is this comma that you are seeing out here after magic comma. That's it. Even if you don't write this, this will still do. So if you'll save this, you'll see magic studying. So you're not putting the comma out here. Just to make it look like a sentence, I was just putting out a comma out here. That's it. Got it? So don't get confused. This is like pretty obvious statement, right? This would be a little confusion. The last statement, this wala statement, this statement, different hobbies of Harry Potter you are saying, Swapnil? Oh, this array. See, what happens is in case of your JavaScript, you can check if anything is an array or not, right? You can check anything is an array or not. So if I'm saying that if I talk about just person, I'm just going to say console log array dot is array. So I'm saying, hey, JavaScript, is this person an array? Is this an array? If I save this, it will give you false. It's saying no, person is not an array, right? But if I'm saying, hey, JavaScript, how about the hobbies, which is inside this person? So I can just come here and say person dot hobbies. So you'll say, oh, hobbies inside the person. Yeah, this is an array. So you could see that this is an array because it contains the square brackets. We have just talked about this, that any variable which will be having square brackets is going to be an array, right? Thank you so much, right? So in this similar case, you can just go around to JavaScript and be like, hey, the address inside this person, is that an array? So you can just go around and just have a look on that. So if you'll save this, it will say, no, this is not an array. That's definitely not an array. It's a object, right? So this is an object literally, right? Yeah, no, no. See, Kalpesh, Samjo, it's a element inside an array. It's not an array. The element which is inside an array, how can that be an array? It's a data. It's not an array, it's a data, right? Hobby 0 is not going to be an array, right? If you're saying that, if you could try to do something like that, try to make this as an array inside an array, like something like this, then you could say that is person.hobby 0 an array. In this case, it will say that yes, it's an array. But if you're keeping data inside this, if you're keeping data inside for such like a string type data, it will say, no, this is not an array, right? So you can also contain array inside an array. That is something that you can totally could do, but not like that, right? So I hope everything is clear till here. Everything is okay for everyone. Everything is okay for everyone. Quickly, yes, no. All right. So let's start with array of objects. Now it's exactly the same thing that I ended the note with, or the last thing that we just discussed. That if the Kalpesh just asked the question that it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be the same thing. How to call an array inside an array? It's going to be the same thing. You can just write hobby 0 dot whatever you want to access around from there, right? You do not need to go so much in depth about that. It's just only going to confuse you. It's not going to be used in FSD. So don't do that, right? If you want to learn all of these things, see, try and understand everything and anything could be done on JavaScript. Anything and everything could be accessed from JavaScript, and anything and everything from JavaScript could be created for, in case what you call this as HTML. If you remember, if you might have joined my session at the time I was teaching you HTML and CSS, I said that without even writing HTML and CSS, I can do everything with JavaScript. Everything in JavaScript I can do. Everything. I can create elements. I can remove elements. I can change the values of the elements dynamically. I can do everything just by writing a JavaScript. Just by writing JavaScript. I can, yeah, DOM, that will do tomorrow, right? I can create elements. I can retrieve elements. I can delete elements. I can change the style of the element. I can do anything if I'm talking about JavaScript. JavaScript is very, very powerful. Very, very powerful, right? So wrap your head around this. I'll just tell you one or two more topics, and then most probably we'll end up with the session. We'll have a look on loops, and then we'll just most probably we'll end up with the session. So this is going to be a little difficult. Functions, most probably we'll do that tomorrow. It's going to be the same time. It's going to be 5 to 6:30, and most probably it will take like 7:15, right? Because tomorrow's session is going to be a little stretched out because we'll be covering out a lot of different things, right? Same link. So let's start with array of objects. Okay, array of objects. Now wrap your head around this, that what is an array of objects. Now try and understand what have we done in case of your array. When, if let's suppose if I'm creating an array, let's say I'm writing this to do, right? So what we have done, we used to mention something like 10, 20, 30, 40. And we used to come down here and we used to say, hey, console log this to do. So if you'll save this, it will just give you an array, right? A normal basic array of number types, right? So all the values that you're seeing out here, these are of the type numbers. Pretty cool stuff, right? But now just try to understand this. What I can do here is I can write objects inside it. Can I not do that? Just have a look on this. Just have a look on this. I'm creating an array and I'm saying, hey, I'm going to contain objects inside. So this is going to be my object number 1, object number 2, object number 3, and object number 4, which is inside an array. No, it's not a two. No. It's just a normal 1D array, which rather than containing number types value, it's containing, object type values, right? Right. So I'm saying I'm not going to contain string. I'm not going to contain numbers. I'm not going to contain float point values. I'm not going to contain anything. Rather, I'm going to contain objects inside array. For example, I'll just show you an example. Don't worry about that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come inside this array, right? And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to mention few comma, right? And now here is, yeah, it's kind of like a JSON representation. So if you know about JSON, it's going to look exactly like JSON, right? And you can just come inside this and you can just say ID, let's say 1. Let's say what the text is. Let's say the text is wash the dishes. Is completed. Is it completed? Because we are doing the to do type of list, kind of like a situation. False, because I'm lazy. And then I'm going to copy this in. And I'm just going to say, take meeting with the team. And the ID here is going to be, let's say 2. Again, I'm lazy. I'm just going to keep it false. I'm just going to put 3. I'm just going to say, eat my lunch. I'm just going to say true because I'm always hungry. So if I just come here and just say console log, and I can just come here and just say to do. So if you'll save this, so you'll see that I have an array, and this array has a length of 3, and every index contain an object inside it, which has 3 values: ID, is completed, and text. Similarly, this ID, which is at index 1, has the same thing: ID is completed in text. And similarly, index number 2, which is going to be this. I hope this is making sense now. This has started to make sense. Does this make sense? Guys, does this make sense? Why do we need to put it inside a string? See, try and understand. It's a number. It's a string. These are different multiple data types that I have in what you call this as JavaScript, right? So I'm just calling this as a number type. This is going to be a string type. That's completely up my choice, right? Now let's talk about how we're going to go around and access these values. Access the values. Let's suppose I want to find out different tasks that I had. So different tasks that I had. So how am I going to do that? Now try and understand this part. So I'm just going to say console log, and inside this console log, I'm going to say the 3 tasks that I had were what? Ab yahan se try and understand how I'm going to access the values. First of all, I'm going to go to the to do, but to do itself is an array, because as you could see that it starts with the square brackets. So to do is an array, right? So I'm just going to write it to do 0. That means I want to have a look on the first object of the to do, and from that I am going to go to dot text. I hope this makes sense to everyone, that how I written this up, right? Because it's an array which is containing an object. It's not an object which is containing an array, because it's an array which is containing an object. So I'll have to write the index first and then what I need to access. Then I'll put a comma just so it looks like a plain text. I'm just going to write it 1. And then I'm going to put a comma out here once more. And then I'm just going to put 2 out here. And I'm just going to save this. You'll say the 3 tasks that I had was wash the dishes, take the meeting with the team, and eat my lunch. Yeah, in the array, the index is always going to start with 0. That is like default. Yeah, this would be the case. So I hope now you can go around and access pretty much anything that I want. So you can go around and tap onto the ID as well. You can just say to do 0.id, to do 0 dot is completed, right? So and so on and so forth, right? You can also convert this data. For example, somebody told me about JSON as well. You can actually convert this data into JSON. So what is the JSON? We'll talk about that when we'll be doing Ajax. Most probably day after tomorrow we'll be doing Ajax. That will be the most interesting session that you'll ever that's ever going to happen with us. Like day after tomorrow's wala session, wherein I'll go around and clone GitHub. JSON is very interesting. So you can go around and convert this into JSON. So I can just go around and write it JSON.parse. And I can just pass this to do and save, and you'll see. Oh, sorry, why am I writing parse? Stringify. Save, and you'll see that it will be a JSON. And in JSON, it typically means that the key value pair both will be all string. So this is a kind of like JSON. We'll talk about JSON for the people who don't know what JSON is. We'll talk about that. JSON means JavaScript object notation. And we'll talk about JSON in very, very detail. It's kind of like a stringified version of something. So I just wanted to tell you that we can do something like that. So are we good till here? We good till here? How to handle object with the you can do that as well. You can put object inside object, arrays inside arrays, or array in object inside an array, which is called as array of objects and stuff like that. So you can do pretty much anything. ID is a variable. Definitely, it's not a variable. I'll say it's a variable. Definitely, ID is a variable, and the type of this variable is number, but it's also a property of this object, the first property, the ID property of this first object, right? So this is the case. No, so don't worry about that, what is coming first and what's coming next. The point is it should exist there. That's the point. So don't worry about what is coming first and what's coming second. So the access part could pretty much be, but the point is ID should be there in the object. So for the people, let me tell you that what Twinkle is asking. Twinkle is saying, hey sir, when I open this up, is completed is coming before than the text part. So is there something to worry about? It's nothing to worry about. It's completely fine. It's just the way how JavaScript renders stuff, right? So it's completely up to his way. Maybe it's a way that, it's going to put all the Boolean part first and all the string part later or stuff like that. So it's completely up to JavaScript how he renders or executes stuff. Chalo. Now let's start with, so it's not an issue how you're going to go around and render that out. It's completely fine. Okay, now let's start with the loops part. Loops in JavaScript is like very, very simple for the people who are coming from C++ and Java background. I don't think that this is going to be very, very different for you people. So that is something that we are going to do. I'll be telling you about typically 3 types of loops. I'll say one is going to be a for loop. The another one is going to be the while loop, and the another one I'll be telling you an array loop, which is like a little bit different, you could say, but I'll tell you the array loop. And a lot of developers write this loop, and generally noobs like us generally get confused. So let's start with for loop. The for loop is like very simple and straightforward. That if let's suppose if I want to have any value for each, I'll be telling you at the time when I'll be doing higher order array methods. There is nothing like do while out here. There is nothing of a concept called as do while. There's a concept called as for each, but that's a higher order array method. We'll talk about that when we're doing all the filter, map, reduce, all of these things. And I'll be telling you about for each, right? So for each is something like completely different. But rather, I should tell you about something called as for off loop. That is something that I can do. if you don't get confused. So there is something of a for off loop as well in Java. Oh, sorry, in JavaScript. So we can have a look on that as well. So let's start with for loop. For loop is very simple. Now, again, I cannot write const I here. Const I is equals to 0. I cannot do that. And I hope you get my point that why I cannot do that, right? Because it's a constant value. And in loops, every time with every iteration, the value of I is going to be changed, or for whatever local variable that you want to keep, the value is definitely it's going to be changed. So in this case, I cannot write something called as const I. Rather, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say let, or rather I can just mention it out there itself. So I'm just going to say for let I is equals to 0. Let's say I less than 11, and let's say I plus plus. So it's going to be exactly the same, and I can just come here and I can just write loop number is, I can just come here and just mention the value of I. So if I actually will save this, you'll see loop will start from 0 and end till 10, wherein 11 won't be included, right? So keep that in mind. Okay. So I'm just going to say let, and if I keep it as const and save this, this will start to show me an error, because loop number 0 will completely work fine. But after 0, it will try to increment the value. And that is something that is not acceptable if you're writing something like of a const, right? And keeping this as var. Now think about this, keeping this as var, even if I come outside this, I can just come here and say log I, save, and you'll see the value of 11 could now be seen. But if I just keep it let, it will only be accessed inside this. And if I'll save this, this will say uncalled I is not identified. So this is the major difference between var and let. I hope now this makes sense. That is why I was saying that it's a block level scope. So this is just a block. Outside this block, I will not be accessible anymore, right? So this is what I mean by block level scope, right? And if I keep this as var, I can access this I. So if I'm just keeping this as var, and if I save this, you can see even outside the loop, I can access the value of I. It's a global, as I said that from the entire JS file, I can access this, whatever I'm keeping as var, right? So var is a global scope, wherein I told you that let is a local scope. So if I save this, everything would run, but outside this parenthesis, outside this block, outside the block of this parenthesis, I will not be, I will not work. But I can actually could come around and just say the value of I, save. This will give me the value of I. This definitely will give me the value of I at every time, but this will not give me the value of I outside the block of the curly brackets, right? And of course, even if I'll write const out here, the only thing is going to be that it's only going to work for one time, but after it goes back to the loop and it tries to reinitialize the value, it will say, hey, you cannot do that. You're trying to reinitialize the value, which is already constant. So now I just hope I made clear that what is var, let, and const. Make sense? Guys, does this make sense now? That what is var, what is let, what is const? Var has a global scope, let has a block level scope, const is also a block level scope, but it's used at the time when you are sure that you're not going to go around and change the values, and that is something that you'll never do in loops, right? So this is a for loop which has a starting point, an ending point, and an increment or a decrement. That completely depends on you how you're gonna do that. Now let's talk about while loops. So in while loops, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to say let I is equals to let's say 10, or maybe let's say I is equals to 0, and then I'll say while let's say I is less than or equals to 10. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm going to just log the value. So I'm just gonna say loop number is, and whatever the number is going to be, and I'm just gonna put I out here like this, and that's it. And at the end, I'm just gonna say I++. Save, and you'll see, oh, let it be let. Save. And yeah, one thing more. If you might have realized something, the reason I called this JavaScript to be a interpreted language you could see the moment it found the error, it's not going to move ahead. It's not going to move ahead. But if it was a compiled language, that is why I was saying that it executes everything line by line. So if it will find the error at line number 5, it will stop there. It will say, hey, correct this error, then only I'm going to move further, because it's not a compiled language. So until and unless this is not rectified, so right, line by line is a interpreter, whole thing compiled together, it's called as a compiler. It's an interpreted language. JavaScript is an interpreted language because it executes everything line by line. So you could see that the while loop number, it starts with 0, end with 10. So this is how you use something which is a while loop. Now let's have a look on the array loops as well. What is this array? We can loop through the arrays as well. Let's suppose if we have an array, let's say I'm just going to take the to do as an array. Or maybe let's say I'm just going to keep I'm just going to say numbers maybe, and in numbers I'm just going to put 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and I want to loop through with an array. This loop is only going to work with arrays. That is something that you need to keep in mind. So this is called as array loop. So I can just say for let I is equals to 0, I is equals to 0, and I'm just going to say I is less than. Now, if you remember, we have a length property. So I can just come here and say numbers.length, right? Numbers.length, and I'm just going to say I plus plus. If you remember, we have talked about this numbers.length property, right? So the length is going to be what? This length is going to be 5 length. So it's just going to start from 0 and it's going to end with 5, right? And then I can just come here and say console log. Now just have a look on this console log. I'm just going to say number, and I'm just going to mention the number as well. So number, and I'm just going to say I plus 1. The reason I'm putting this I plus 1, because I know the I is going to start from 0. So I'm just going to say number 1 and then the value of that, whatever it's going to be. And I'm just going to say number, numbers, I. That's it. So if I'll save this, this should work. So you could say number 1 is 10, number 2 is 20, number 3 is 30, number 4 is 40, number 5 is 50. I hope this is making sense. Does this make sense? This array wala loop? I hope this is making sense. So you can actually go around and do something like that. So a lot of developers have a habit of writing as a loop, something like this. Should I tell you for off? Let's have a look on for off, and then we'll end up with the session. So please explain I plus plus versus plus plus I. Yeah, we'll do that. Don't worry about that. We'll do that. Right? We'll do that. Chale? So let's do this let's do this for the last time. And this is the most easiest loop that you can use if you're working on arrays. This is the most easiest, most shortest loop that you'll ever come across with any of the array methods. So you can just come here and just say for, and inside for you can just say let number of numbers. Now you could see that I'm saying number. That's a singular number. So this is a local variable like I. This is a local variable like I, and you're saying the numbers, which is an array, which is this numbers. And you can just come here and just say log number, the singular number, save, and it will give you numbers. It will loop through the array and it will just give you numbers 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Right. So this is the most smallest loop that you can write for any array, which is called as for off. Right. So you can just come here and say for let whatever the local variable here is of the array, and you can just come here and say console log whatever the number is going to be. I hope this makes sense to everyone. Sure. So this is the case. Yeah, so this is the most shortcut that you can go around and put if you're working on any of the loops for that matter, specifically if it's going to be on what do you call this as the array part. So this is something like this. Yeah, it's kind of like a foreign. If you might have worked in Python, it's kind of like a foreign kind of like a situation. Right. No, the value here is going to see, you have a habit of writing it as I, right? So you can just come here and say console.log I. That's it. It's the same thing. But rather than calling this I was calling this number, right? So don't get confused. It's exactly like let I of something, right? Console.log I. You have a habit of writing I, but this is how the industry works, right? Industry, this is how you actually write any of the loops if you want to write it, something like this. So I'm just going to say for let one number of all of these numbers, the 5 numbers, the 10, 20, 30, 40 that I have, right? So I'm just going to call this let number of numbers, right? All right, then. So are we good till here? For loop in the kuch bhi nahi hai. For loop it has a starting point where you want to start, because the starting point is going to be starting from index number 0, and then where you want to go around with, let's say less than 11 I plus plus, and it will start with loop number. Now I'm saying $I, the value of I. Right now the value of I is 0, so it will just say the loop number is 0. Oh, the while loop. So let's discuss the while loop for a little second. So while loop mein the initial value is 0. So try and understand this. I'll explain each and every one by one. Okay, na? So for loop mein everyone is fine. For loop everyone is fine. If you're fine with the for loop, just give me a yes. We'll move ahead. For loop, everybody is happy with for loop. Other people, quickly. Okay. Now let's talk about while loops. What we are doing while loop mein, we are saying I'm starting with 0, right? The initial value of I is 0. So I'll just come here. I'll say 0. The initial value is 0. I'll say 0. Just give me yes or no. 0 is less than equals to 10. Yes or no? True or false? 0 is less than equals to 10. 0 is definitely less than 10. So it's going to be true. It will come inside this block. It will just give loop number is 0. Initially the value is 0. And then I incremented the value by 1. So 0 will now become 1. It will go back. 1 is less than equals to 10. Yes, console.log, loop number is 1. It will come here. It will say 2. Then again back. So it will say 2 is less than equals to 10. Go so on, so forth until the value does not become till 10. So there would be a situation when the I will be 10. So it will say 10 is less than or equals to 10. So 10 is equals to 10. So or value property does make sense. So it will say loop number is 10, and then I plus plus, which will become 11. It will go back, check the condition. It will say 11 is less than equals to 10. Is 11 less than 10? No, definitely not. False, it will come out. So it will only execute till loop number is 10. I hope the while loop is okay for everyone. The while loop is okay. The while loop is good. Now, if you'll have a look on this array loop, this array loop is exactly the same as that of what you call this as a for loop. It's exactly the same thing, but we generally use this in arrays at the most, right? So you could see that it's exactly the same thing. It's starting with index number 0. It's going to numbers.length. What is numbers? This, right? And the length of the numbers, length means what is going to be the number of elements inside it. You could see the number of elements is 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it will automatically put 5 out here, right? Numbers.length. So it will say starting from 0, ending at 5, because the length is 5, I plus plus, console log number, and whatever the value is going to be. So right now the value of I is starting from 0. So it will say number 0 plus 1, 1. Right? You could see that I value, I starting from 0. The initial value of I is 0, but I'm saying you have to put the value as 0 plus 1. Right? So it will say number 1 and whatever the number value of this numbers array is going to be, the ith value, which is 0. So it will check for this part. Right? Again, we'll go back. I will become 1. I will become from 0 to 1. Then it will be number 1 plus 1, that is going to be 2. So it will say number 2 is dollar number I. I ki value kya hai? Still 1. So it will give you this value, which is 20. Then it will become 2. 2 plus 1, 3. Number 3 colon and the value of number I, which is 2, which is 30. So on, it will keep on doing the same thing till all the numbers are not exhausted. That's it. That's it. And then for off, you can put any of the local variable that you want. You are habitual of I. So I'm just going to say let I of numbers. What is numbers? This. So when you write off, internally JavaScript uses this itself, but you do not need to write any of these things. So you can just come here and say that I need to loop around with everything which is inside numbers. and I want to log the value of the same, and you could see that it will still work the same way, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. I hope this makes sense to everyone now. That you will see, it's all about practice. It's all about practice. Okay, the more you will practice with JavaScript, this will start to make sense to you people, right? Because JavaScript is very user friendly. It's not like something hard and fast, kind of like a code that you'll have to write around. It is exactly like Python, right? But it's kind of like a little more tilted way, because it's actually faster than Python, right? So fast. And if you talk about the power efficiency and powerfulness of doing heavy tasks, so Python wins over JavaScript, right? So that is the case. अरे previous video का link है क्या किसी के पास? Does anybody has a link for the previous video? Please put in the chat section so that they could get the previous video wala. Okay, so yeah, we have the most senior person, the what do you call them, as CTO, the Chief Technical Officer of of the company. So he'll be interacting with you people, right? And for any doubts which will be related to operations and all of these things, I'm handing over to him. I hope you do not have any doubts as of now. If you want to ask doubts, you can ask me your doubts, or we'll end up with the session then, and Kanav sir will take over it. Shall we? Yeah, I'll definitely will put the recording on. It's on YouTube, and sir will follow you up along with the same. So I'll handle everything up to sir. Another sir will have a look. So if you're good, just give me a yes. Anna? Ha, sure. So if you're good till here, just give me a yes, we'll move ahead. We can discuss and cater on to any of the doubts. Either you can take it up on my LinkedIn if you want. So put that doubt on the LinkedIn. I can explain you up on LinkedIn. If you want, I can explain it to you tomorrow. Even if you want, we can communicate anywhere if you want. Yeah, I'll begin it up on 4. Oh, sorry, 5:30. Whoa, what I'm saying. I'm going to start it on at like exact 5 on 5. Okay, so LinkedIn ka link, I'll give it to you that. So LinkedIn, Anna. So I'm completely okay to communicate anywhere that you want, right? So this is the LinkedIn. Sure, tomorrow. I'll try to do that. Because see, पता होता क्या है, a lot of students ask me the same questions over and over again, and I have to typically answer each and every one. In that case, you'll get the links of everything that you want, right? Kanav sir will forward you out to the same. So Kanav sir is here in the meeting, and I'll ask him to do that. Okay. So are we good? Okay, we good? Can I hand it over to Kanav sir then? If you're good, just give me a yes. We'll move ahead. Chalo, nice. All right then. See you guys. Bye bye. Have a lovely conversation with Kanav sir. You can ask any doubts that you have. He's the CTO of the company, and he takes care of every of the technical domain, right? So you can have a communication with them. Okay. Bye bye. See you.
All right. So hi guys. Am I audible to everyone?